ladies and gentlemen. I will start proceedings. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to first of all thank Policy Exchange for organising this, as well as thanking our authors, because I think for those of us that are serving, the commentariat, the interest in our profession and where we can contribute, the people in the audience today, those online, we are definitely, and it feels to me we're definitely the beneficiaries of these conversations. So I'm delighted to be here and to help host. I'm very conscious that I'm sitting in the middle between a very distinguished general and a very eminent historian, and you've got a mediocre admiral in the middle. So we'll talk for 20-25 minutes and then open the floor to questions. And I suppose my first point, it's a simple one. One is can you just sort of explain how the two of you got together and the idea for this book and how that worked? And then to take us on this journey that I think is really interesting, in that you have selected since the Second World War to now, and some of those high points and some of the aspects that you're trying to bring out for us all to benefit from, because there seem to be some things that are very distinct and some things that are common all the way through, but it's really just, to me, the interesting piece was this snapshot of this period in history.
Maybe if I answer the first part of that and David can answer the second. David and I knew one another before I suggested the idea of this book. I'd interviewed him a couple of times at the Cliveden Literary Festival, and he'd interviewed me about Winston Churchill. He's an expert on Churchill at the New York Historical Society. And so soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I got in touch with him and said, look, it would be really useful to have a book that puts the invasion of Ukraine in its military historical context, not necessarily its political and geopolitical context, because everybody's going to be doing that. But let's just look at how this war pans out, the way in which you can see various aspects of it that relate to the past, and also, of course, that might have hints and signposts towards the future. And so we got on to the publishers. The publishers said, how on earth are you going to break it down? And I said, well, David's going to write about all the countries he's invaded, and I'm going to fill in a few other bits and pieces. And then we passed chapters to one another. He wrote the Vietnam chapter as well as Iraq and Afghanistan, and we worked together. Fortunately, he got a PhD in military history at Princeton, so I was already starting with an expert and a soldier scholar, as he's called. So it actually worked out to be an awful lot easier. It's the first time I'd ever co-authored anything. I had nerves, needless to say, but luckily I didn't have to worry at all.
Let me actually really just start by thanking you, Shipmate, for taking the helm of this particular event, and what a pleasure really to see so many familiar faces and so many people with whom I was privileged to serve over the years, not the least of which is my favorite Glaswegian here when he was NATO Secretary General, and my boss, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, would leave the meeting and say, what the hell did he say again? and of course, we have the many lords in this room, including, I love, Baron Godson of Thorney Island, wherever that is. He has confirmed that when you moved from the old location, by the way, we were saying, I don't recognize this place at all. I didn't realize during COVID you moved, but that you still do confirm that this is still Thorney Island and not edging into the realm of Baron of Belgravia. But again, really just wonderful to do this. And I should also note that yet another event so we've done so many events over the years, Andrew and I have, and I always found them delightful. But one of them was at the Army Museum. This is for the George III book, and we were trying to craft, we're trying to help whatever it was, society that serves veterans of the Army. And so we decided that the research question for that night would be, could the British have won the American War of Independence? And he posed this to me, and I said, of course they could have, if they had had a competent civil military counterinsurgency campaign, which
Very tragic.
they did not. But no, we've had great fun with this book. I should point out for those of you, and again, there's some more still back there, and again, we've already signed them, don't worry. What was interesting is that we wrote, as always, in the third person as historians, and I should note that with all due respect, my degree at Princeton is actually in a combination of international relations and economics, not military history, although I've certainly studied it hard and perhaps participated in it a bit of it. But we were in the third person, as of course you always do as a historian, and it was very awkward for me in the Iraq chapters, especially because we cover a 10-year period during which I was a 2-star, invaded it, and then came back as a 3-star, then as the 4-star for the Surge, then Central Command over top of it, eventually CIA as we pulled out, and would write, then General Petraeus or Director Petraeus did this or did that, and the editor very sensibly came back and said, why don't you just do this in the first person, and we'll put a little asterisk at the top that says that you drafted it. But we had great fun with it, and actually, what really emerged from this that is, I think, of most importance is just the reminder of the crucial nature of strategic leadership, and where in the book we find great strategic leadership, that which gets the big ideas right based on a real understanding of the situation and so forth, communicates the big ideas effectively, oversees their implementation competently, and then determines how to refine them again and again and again, you achieve success. And we have a number of those cases in this book, some of which are, again, quite delightfully and quintessentially British, such as the Dhofar rebellion in Oman, where, the crown prince goes to Sandhurst, he's trained up, he goes back, overthrows his father, of course, and then partners with a very astute British brigadier in putting down that rebellion. Of course, the British brigadier then also writes a delightful book titled "We Won a War," modestly. But it was so much fun to do that kind of thing, to look at Malaya again, to look at, again, some of the very successful campaigns, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, again, the first Gulf War, where the U.S. military goes to the White House burdened by the lessons of Vietnam, not particularly eager to deploy to the Middle East and get involved in something that seemed quite uncertain, that didn't meet the Weinberger doctrine of the Powell rules up front. And President Bush at the very outset says, this shall not stand. That's a pretty good big idea. Okay, we got it. And military takes orders and then proceeds to figure out how to ensure that it does not stand. First of all, that they don't invade further into Saudi Arabia. Then we amass the forces and position them and so forth to ensure that the Iraqis either have to withdraw or we will expel them, which we ultimately did. And then some cases, frankly, where we failed to get the big ideas right. Not only we, but those who were before us. Look at the French in Indochina, Indochine, where they came up with a great idea. Let's go to Dien Bien Phu and we'll build a big defensive there, and we'll attract the attention of the North Vietnamese, and of course we'll defeat them. We'll finally bring them to bear, finally bring them to fight. And did they ever? And of course they withdrew, having had to surrender at Dien Bien Phu. And then the Americans who came in dismissed the suggestions of the South Vietnamese that perhaps they should be worried about what's going on in the villages and hamlets and craft, again, a civil military counterinsurgency campaign, and said, no, 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 we've learned in Korea that what you need are big divisions like ours, and we'll design them just like ours, and we'll help equip them and train them. And we then pursued this big war, a war of attrition, of body count, failing to get the big ideas right, at least until 1968 when General Abrams took over, but by which time we had lost the domestic political support. So again, it was really a very, very significant reminder of the critical component of that kind of strategic leadership. Maggie Thatcher, the Falklands, this will not stand, and then the military developed, first of all, again, a very, very good strategic approach, and then executed it very impressively as well. And it literally led us, having gone through all these chapters, to go back and to rewrite the very first chapter to really describe in detail this intellectual construct for strategic leadership with these 4 critical tasks that I've described, without adequate performance of which a campaign is doomed.
So can I pick up on that, because that was one of the pieces for me, from a sort of slightly selfish sense, was I really enjoyed the fact that you described what strategic leadership is,
Yep.
what the facets are, the importance of good strategic judgment, and so on. But the piece to me that is a sort of interesting dilemma is judging which of our leaders will be a good strategic leader, because it feels like it's a rear view mirror that actually it's very clear that Margaret Thatcher, come the moment, was extraordinarily strong. It's the same with President Zelensky. When he made that comment, I don't need a taxi, I need ammo, it was a phenomenal act of strategic leadership. And it's trying to understand what are the techniques and what are the attributes that the individuals in those positions have to develop in order to reach those examples that you provided as to where you think they have been able to display strategic leadership, strategic art.
Sure, let me start and then I'll let Andrew provide additional historical context, if you will. I think the most important component of strategic leadership, without which all the rest doesn't matter, is strategic judgment. Again, you have to get the big ideas right. I don't care how eloquent you are, how charismatic, energetic, determined, attractive, you name all the other qualities that go into leadership, principled, forthright character, all these things. If you don't get the big ideas right up front, the rest of it doesn't frankly matter. And by the way, the same is true in business. The same is true. I remember when I was commanding the surge and they asked me, what do you look for in your 3-star operational commander? They knew that I was a big runner and sort of a fitness buff and so forth. Do you look for someone who can keep up with you running? And I said, have you looked at General Odierno lately? I mean, does it look like he can, his knees were destroyed from football or something. He was, obviously an interior lineman or something like that. No, it was about his brilliant strategic judgment, that he could look 6 months into the future, having now, of course, there I was determining the strategic big ideas, but then at each level below that, crucially at the operational level, because he was overseeing all of our conventional ground forces, he had to translate those into operational campaign and so forth. And the quality that you wanted most was that component of judgment, that ability to understand the context in a very nuanced, rigorous manner, and then to get the big ideas right, without which, again, all else is for naught.
I'd like to just add a couple of examples that backs that up. The first one being Korea, because when David talks about charismatic leaders, you automatically think about Douglas MacArthur. However, he got the big idea wrong. The idea of going up to the Yalu River, of essentially drawing and encouraging the Chinese to get involved in the war was a catastrophically bad idea. And then you have Matthew Ridgway taking over from him after he's sacked, after MacArthur's sacked, and he then gets the big ideas right. And so as David said, charisma and eloquence and so on is not the answer. The other thing is, of course, that if you have bad strategic leadership, however good the whole situation might seem at the beginning of a war, the Chinese Civil War being a classic example of this, where the Kuomintang controlled all of the major cities, had vast amounts of equipment that they'd taken off the Japanese at the end of the Second World War. They had an army 4 or 5 times the size of the Communist army, and yet, after making a mistake after mistake of getting the strategic ideas wrong, they managed to lose that war in 3 years. So we saw it so often. The witness of history was so clear to us as we wrote chapter after chapter that we had to do exactly what David said. Had to go back to chapters 1 and 2 and look again at the early struggles and to essentially insert the concept of strategic leadership into them, and they just stood out at us incredibly clearly. So that is one of the major takeaways, I think, of our book.
And with respect to Zelensky, who has, I think, been positively Churchillian, again noting that Andrew wrote the best single-volume biography of Churchill by far, of course.
Yeah.
But his first 2 1/3 years in office were not that particularly noteworthy, actually. Most would assess that there were modest achievements in the reforms that he was elected to implement. And yet, as you noted, he gets the very big idea right off the bat. I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. All Ukrainian men are going to stay in the country, and on from there. And then, having gotten sort of the big ideas right, proved to be a brilliant communicator. Of course, not a surprise, given that he was an actor who, of course, played the president so well that he was elected president. And then has been quite deft and impressive in overseeing the big ideas. In fact, Andrew and I were there about 4 months or so ago. I was there also about 4 weeks ago. And very high quality military strategic leadership as well. You know, of course, General Zaluzhny, your counterpart there, and so forth. And then they have very impressively identified how they need to refine the big ideas from time to time when that's necessary, such as with this counteroffensive that was launched, where all of a sudden they recognize that these minefields, despite all of the open source imagery and satellites and everything else, the minefields are miles deep, not hundreds of kilometers deep. They're not going to be able to get through them because they have no air power, and the Russian drones are right on top of whatever is trying to breach these obstacles. And so they adapt. No plan survives contact with the enemy. This one did not. They adapted, and they had shifted to essentially infantry squads infiltrating, picking these defenses apart, and achieving 100, 150 meters a day rather than many kilometers per day, while also doing some impressive work to deny the Russians the use of Sevastopol and the sea bases, air bases, and even hitting the Black Sea Fleet headquarters during the middle of their command and staff meeting, which I thought was quite artful and accurate and devastating.
I'm going to resist and not go there. So I wonder, before we open this to the audience, can we now jump to, I think, another really difficult feature that you highlight, which is the future of war. And you touch on the dilemma of trying to predict what that future is, and then some of the attributes that you're trying to draw out that we need to focus on.
We do. The last chapter, chapter 10, is about cyber and space and sensors, drones, AI, robotics, and so on, and to try to see what a future war is going to look like. In a sense, Ukraine does have signposts and hints, but it certainly doesn't have all of them, not least because Ukraine is not NATO. And so when we look into all of that, one of the things that we really concentrated on was, of course, AI and robotics, and the kind of war and the kind of fighting that will take place when it's done by mass data and by machines that don't have remorse or pity or cowardice, but they do have all sorts of other things that are almost equally nerve-wracking. Over to you, David.
Well, I think that one of the big points that we try to make is the imperative of transforming our forces, particularly when it comes to the Indo-Pacific theater. You remember there was an old adage back in the Cold War days that said, what can be seen can be hit, what can be hit can be killed. And we repeated this all the time and recited it and so forth. The truth is we couldn't see all that much. We certainly couldn't hit it, especially if it was moving, and therefore you couldn't kill all that much, even though, yes, air-land battle doctrine called for extending the depth of the battlefield, et cetera. It was more aspirational than realistic, frankly. Now it's reality. You can see everything, as you well know, Tony. You can hit everything. Certainly you can defend it. There's a variety of actions you can take to harden, disperse, and again erect various air and ballistic missile defenses. But at the end of the day, we nonetheless have to transform. This is an imperative from a very small number of very large platforms that are incredibly expensive, incredibly capable. I loved having 2 entire aircraft carrier task forces in the U.S. Central Command area back in the day, but that's not necessarily what you want in the future of warfare. You need to go from that to a massive number of unmanned systems, not just in the air, but on the ground, surface of the sea, subsea, space, even the equivalent in cyberspace, that are increasingly not just remotely piloted, but actually algorithmically piloted. In other words, driven by the human in the loop being the person who actually designs the software that guides it, that develops the conditions that the machine must meet. And by the way, it meets them more effectively than we can, better than the human eye and a variety of other sensors and tests. So that's a real imperative. There is widespread recognition of that in the ranks of those who currently serve, but there are also widespread vested interests that prevent the transformation at the speed that should be undertaken by US, UK, and other major Western forces. Again, a true imperative if we want to ensure that the elements of deterrence are very solid, and those are, of course, a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, this is what we're talking about here, but then also of your willingness to employ those capabilities on the other hand. And we have to be very conscious when it comes to that what we do in one part of the world, whether we continue to support Ukraine or not, for example, reverberates, echoes out in other parts of the world that are trying to divine whether or not the West, the US, has the strategic patience and commitment and determination to carry out something of significance. I would contend, in fact, that the US decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and the way it was conducted was at least one of the factors, the elements that led Putin to believe that he could invade Ukraine without perhaps provoking the kind of enormous response that you've seen from the US, the UK often ahead of the US, I should note, commendably, in the response and support of Ukraine. And $44 billion of US assistance later, which is an enormous quantity. I mean, that's 10 billion more than the entire Italian annual defense budget, I believe. Even notwithstanding some of those decisions taking a bit longer than should have been the case, to be sure. But again, what happens in one part of the world does have implications for other parts. Think of the Syria red line that was not a red line. Bashar al-Assad must go, but we then don't do anything to make him go. As I said, the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, even with hindsight, the inadequate response to the Russian occupation of Crimea and support for separatists in the Donbass.
Thank you. Can I just piggyback on the AI and software hardware piece? So just to how it feels to me. So I think there are some institutional barriers. I think there are some straightforward barriers in terms of our imagination, and can we see this clearly enough? Mm-hmm. And then I still think we haven't grasped the full extent of the implications. So at the moment, I think there's at one level, it's a very fast journey in the way that drones have been introduced into Ukraine and the speed that it's going. At another level, it's still not fast enough, and there's a hardware issue of how many drones can you make in what kind of timescale in order to have an impact. But the piece to me that's the distinction that you're alerting to us to in the book is that software element. So if I take the hardware piece, at the moment we're providing hundreds of drones, then looking to do thousands of drones. You then have the very similar way of training that we do at the moment. So how do you get thousands of drone operators in order to be able to take advantage of that substantial leap in hardware? But what I think you're saying is where we need to be getting to is the notion that you have 10,000 drones and you actually only have half a dozen people that are controlling those drones, because it's the AI and the software that actually dictates the attack and the way that those drones are operating. And that then, when you take that back, that is a completely different training regime. Yes. It's a completely different approach. Mm-hmm. Is that what your prescription is?
Yes, and I understand the ethical concerns about removing the human from the direct loop. Now you're going to have the human on the loop, if you will. Again, because the human in the loop is going to be the one who designs the software program that establishes the conditions. Commanders will do this. Again, they're going to have to determine what are the conditions that have to be met. Because otherwise, Andrew has a great phrase actually that he dug up somewhere. I think the U.S. Air Force said something like the biggest challenge with unmanned systems is manning them. Because we calculated that it took, when I was demanding more and more and more Predators, it took about 140 to 150 personnel to keep one unblinking eye in the sky. Now that means it's typically 3 platforms, because there's one in orbit, there's one heading out there, there's one heading back, et cetera, et cetera. But then all the people that had to fly it, payload it, the payload operator actually piece of it, actually arm it, repair it, keep the communications network functioning, all of this, because it's flown by people back in Nevada after it's taken off out in the theater, skips off a couple satellites from Afghanistan. All of these different, not to mention taking what these intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems are bringing back, analyzing it, fusing it with others, preparing a finished product, and then actually sharing it, disseminating it, and so forth, and just a constant process. So at least some of these functions, particularly if it's, again, a suicide or an attack or something like that, many functions will be eliminated in terms of the humans, because the human is going to be the person that does the programming, not the flying, not the operation. Now again, I recognize there are and should be substantial ethical issues here, and we have to come to grips with that. But the fact is, if you don't actually go completely to the machine, your machine's going to lose to the other machine, because the human in the loop can't respond as quickly as is the case otherwise.
Yes, and that's why we should be very concerned about the recent news that the Chinese have bought 50,000 suicide drones from Iran. And the knowledge also that when it comes to fighter jets that have AI beat the fighter jets that have humans. And this is something that means that we in the West have just got to have faster and better kit than anybody else in the world. It's quite a straightforward thing. It's been true really since the invention of the jet aircraft. We've just got to have the best and spend whatever it takes to make sure that we do have the best.
What's that saying you have about the insurance of, the cost of deterrence is
always less than the cost of the of fighting the war when that deterrence fails. No, exactly. And there's also a great line from an American general about the tank, which is that tanks are a bit like dinner jackets, in that you don't need them very often, but when you do, nothing else will do.
Right.
You see why I enjoy hanging out with Baron Robertson of Belgravia.
On that note, can I open it to the floor? Yes, please, the gentleman.
King's College. Is that working? No, it is now. General Petraeus, you went into Iraq and Afghanistan without a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency plan. In fact, you personally had to write one for US forces. Do you think that counterinsurgency lessons have been harvested enough from those conflicts? I mean, no one expects the United States, especially with this administration, to put boots on the ground anywhere. But if and when they do, and we join you, do we have the right doctrine this time?
We do have the right doctrine. I'm actually happy to report that we actually even updated the classic version of this, of course, which it should still be available for download, the 2006 manual that we wrote. And not only that, we have retained the capabilities that we learned were necessary for this as well. We have more special forces than we had at the beginning of these campaigns. We established in the U.S. Army what's called the Advise and Assist Security Force Assistance Brigades. And because of the advent of drones, we've actually been able to change how we conduct counterinsurgency. With respect, we actually do have boots on the ground still, enabling other countries to carry out counterinsurgency campaigns. We still have a few thousand troops in Iraq, some in northeastern Syria. But what they're doing is what is best described as advise, assist, and enable, rather than actually doing it ourselves. And so what we're doing is we're doing training and equipping. We have advisors with them. Those advisors can access enablers, if you will, again, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, precision air munitions, sometimes precision ground-to-ground, surface-to-surface, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, we enabled the Iraqi security forces and our Syrian Democratic Force partners to defeat the Islamic State and to eliminate the caliphate in that manner. We had about 5,000 troops on the ground as opposed to the 165,000 that we had to deploy during the surge because the circumstances were so dire. We were in a Sunni-Shia civil war, which was escalating in violence very alarmingly. So, and again, we also still have forces in the Horn of Africa. We still have forces out in modest numbers in Southeast Asia. It's almost as if we discovered the British manner, which is, you know, with a handful of civil servants and the odd soldier or two, you run a couple of continents around the world, more than a couple. So I actually do think, and there was reassuringly, after overreacting and sort of removing all counterinsurgency references in the national military strategy, there actually is a recognition that we will still need the capabilities for irregular warfare writ large, under which you would have, again, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, these others, peacekeeping, and so forth. Even as correctly, the main effort, the focus is shifting to that of peer competitor and the all-important theater of the Indo-Pacific, where we must absolutely deter, dissuade. I mean, every single morning in Beijing, the leadership, when they wake up, has to say, okay, well, not today, at least until there's leadership and perhaps partners and so forth, where we can get back to trying to have as mutually beneficial a relationship as is possible, rather than what is correctly described right now as severe competition.
Thank you. Charles Moore.
Thank you very much. Question to
sorry, just so people online.
Charles Moore.
People online need to
thank you. Yes.
Need to hear you as well.
Charles Moore. Strategic. The word strategic put in front of a lot of things, and one of the things that it's put in front of, very important at this moment, is the word ambiguity, strategic ambiguity.
Yes. Yeah.
When is, on the whole, one tends to think that ambiguity is a bad thing in politics and military affairs, and that we need to know where we are. But strategic ambiguity is the doctrine, the US doctrine in relation to Taiwan. Can you explain it, and do you believe in it? Do you believe in it?
Yeah, no, I think it has has enormous value because it describes what we have arrived at in our relationship with China. Again, the biggest of the big ideas with China, I think, should be to be very firm without being needlessly provocative. And in the front row, we have the woman who helped craft the national security strategy that really, I think, most embodied that as a shift in the previous administration when they really changed the conversation on China, one that has actually remained quite constant since then. If anything, in fact, now both parties in Congress, they don't agree on much, but they agree on that particular component. And yet, strategic ambiguity is necessary for that portion that is, don't be needlessly provocative. And I think it's accurate to describe that. Now, yes, you have a president of the United States who also recognizes, it seems to me, I think this is not just someone who can't ever leave something left unsaid. I think it's someone who recognizes that it actually helps to be slightly clarifying and asserting 4 times, as he has, that we would take action if there was a threat to Taiwan. Of course, then Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, rushes out to the podium and says there's no change to our policy of strategic ambiguity in the various, these different diplomatic agreements, we recite those, et cetera. So I think that is, of course, you're trying to balance this, keeping in mind the all-important need to ensure that the components of deterrence that I enumerated are solid, without, again, being needlessly provocative. So yes, I think that it still is important. It's not something that should be rejected. There have been people who, I think, rashly have suggested that it should be jettisoned. I think that's a way to spark a crisis. And again, I look at Nadia just to make sure that she's nodding her head reasonably well and grading my work.
Can we go to the front row? And then we'll go to somebody online.
Thank you very much, Admiral, and congratulations to General and Andrew on your book. When we first met 17 years ago, I thought we had one thing in common. My father was Central Army Commander of the Indian Army during Storm and Norman Schwarzkopf's time, and you were Central Army Commander. But now I discovered we've got another thing in common.
Central Command Commander, actually.
Yes.
We had the Army under us as well.
Yes. And then now we have something else in common, Chelsea supporters. So,
there we go. Shifted from Man United about 7 years ago. Just caught the wave, you know.
And I'm Lord Billimore of Chelsea, so there we are.
There you go.
Just to ask you both about the relationship between the military and government. And the specific example, I don't know if it's in your book, of General Manekshaw in April 1971, when Indira Gandhi ordered him to go to war after the millions of refugees were coming in from East Pakistan. And to the whole cabinet he said, I'm not going to do it. And he gave his strategic reasons, the weather, the Chinese, the snow melting. And he said, give me my time and I will do it. And she almost fired him. And it's an example of moral courage, standing up to the authority of the Prime Minister. She listened to him, and the war took place in December and was won in Bangladesh was liberated in 2 weeks. So that, and he joked after that saying there's a fine line between becoming a field marshal and being fired. So that whole idea of moral courage, standing up to a government. And next is, after that was a lot of pressure. But more
important than that, with great respect, is he got the big idea right.
Exactly.
So again, certainly you have to put forward the big ideas. You have to have moral courage in doing that. And you know, I'd like to think that at some key junctures, actually, if you read Secretary of Defense Bob Gates' book, he recounts at one point where literally, I think he said, I thought I would have to throttle Petraeus because he was not going to be unheard on this particular issue involving Afghanistan. So I think it's a very important component. But I would actually single out, more important than that is that he got the big idea right, and then actually, and had the courage to put it forward, and then had the ability to oversee its execution, to communicate it, oversee the execution, and undoubtedly make adaptations during the actual execution of it. So those are the qualities, that's great strategic leadership. But it also can lead to your firing.
Yeah. Well, that's the point I was going to make. You know, ultimately, it has to be in a democracy. It has to be the politicians' decision, and that's why President Truman was right to fire Douglas MacArthur, for example, the classic example of the charismatic leader who went too far, got the big idea wrong, and therefore it cost him his job, and that was right.
Can we go online, please, and to Jonathan Foreman from Civitas?
How high tech this is here, my gosh.
And Jonathan, if you, we should be able to hear you if you're ready with your question, please.
I bet they have to allow him to unmute. How much we've learned about this.
Well, whilst we're teeing up Jonathan, should we go back into the room and the front row, please? Yes.
Hi, Nadia Shadlow, Hudson Institute. I have a question about the relationship between getting the strategic idea right, which you've both emphasized, but when it clashes with sort of an operational breakdown or the breakdown of the capabilities that you need, so that the idea can be right, but if the rest of government isn't responding effectively or timely, you don't always control everything in the field, right? So how often in the book, in the conflicts you describe, did that disconnect happen? I mean, it seems to me it's not just the idea. You actually then have to bring the capabilities to bear, and that's not always in the commander's control.
Well, but when you're developing the big ideas, you have to understand all aspects of the strategic context, and you have to understand your strengths and limitations. Now, yes, you can get all that right, and then you find out that perhaps there's not the strategic commitment that you thought was present when this was developed. I'd witness Afghanistan, but also witness it took us 9 years again to get the big ideas right, actually more than that, to get the inputs right in Afghanistan. It took us from 2001, brilliant campaign to topple the Taliban and eliminate the Al-Qaeda sanctuary, albeit with bin Laden getting away at that point in time. But it took us 9 years then, because of the shift in focus to Iraq, to get not just the big ideas right, need for a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, inescapable, but the level of resources right, the right organizational architecture, which is not trivial in a coalition and U.S. chain of command where you're dual-hatted and there's lots of other limitations. The right number of diplomats, development workers, spies, and others. The right preparation of our forces, which we didn't get right for a number of years as well, the right leaders, et cetera, et cetera. The problem was that in that case, during the speech that actually announced the buildup of these forces, there was an addition that told the enemy when we were going to draw down. And that was ill-advised. It was actually not something that was raised during the 9 meetings of the National Security Council process. It was really at the very last minute in the Oval Office on a Sunday evening at 5 p.m., at least that I learned, that this is part of it, and it was essentially take it or leave it kind of situation. So yeah, but again, I think it's really crucial to understand what you have to work with to begin with. What is the level of commitment? Because only then can you try to get the big ideas right, and they have to acknowledge the limitations. So that's how I guess I would put it. But then the question is, do you have the strategic patience, which we also lacked in Afghanistan? I mean, I would contend that we actually had alternatives to withdrawing this modest force that we had, having not had a loss in life in 18 months and spending less, I don't know what the percentage of our defense budget, but 25 billion out of 850 billion is certainly affordable. Now it sounds like we have the online working.
But just before that, I'm just going to, yes, the key thing is to control all the levers of power. And a great example of where that didn't go right is the Chinese Civil War, where Chiang Kai-shek really couldn't trust his own generals to carry out direct orders. And sometimes he'd be in the beginning of a large maneuver, and involving hundreds of thousands of men, and one of his warlords just simply wouldn't obey orders, wouldn't turn up, wouldn't capture that particular city or region, and so it became completely impossible for him. Unless you control all the levers of power, you just simply aren't going to be able to carry out the big idea.
And then you have some contextual circumstances that can just be really, really hard. I would contend that, yes, I've been critical that we didn't get the big ideas right for over a decade in Vietnam, but that context, that situation was so exceedingly difficult. The imperfections of our host nation partners, the colonial appeal, or decolonial appeal, if you will, and all the rest of these other factors made that very, very difficult, even if we had gotten the big ideas right. No guarantee. Same with the sanctuaries that the Afghans, Taliban enjoyed in Pakistan.
Thank you. Right, we'll try again with the online, and Jonathan Foreman from Civitas.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all. This has been fascinating. My question is for General Petraeus. And it's about doctrine and preparation for the next war. You've talked about how after Vietnam, the United States military sort of didn't want to do counterinsurgency, so didn't train to do it, and didn't have a field manual until the one you did in 2006. In the news recently, the United States Marine Corps, under the recently retired General Berger, seems to have been deciding that they would prepare and train for only one conflict, that against China in the Pacific. And they're giving up their tanks, they're not going to prepare for regular maneuver expeditionary warfare. What do you think of that, and do you think it's a good idea?
Well, first of all, I'm a little bit humble about my assessment of this, given that I was an Army general for 37 years, not the Marine Corps. And also I'd be a bit careful that doing away with some capabilities of traditional Marine expeditionary units and so forth, but adding others, doesn't mean that they are only capable of carrying out operations in the Indo-Pacific region. They still have Marine expeditionary units that are on amphibs all around the world and still capable of taking on a very, very substantial number of different contingencies. In fact, the bulk of those that they have typically been involved in, it's really more ahistorical that you saw them on the ground for a sustained period of time, as in Iraq or Afghanistan, landlocked in the case of Afghanistan, than was the normal case. So I'm very cautious about grading General Berger's work, frankly, even though some of his predecessors as commandant certainly didn't exercise that same caution and raised concerns about it. I'd really like to see where it goes first, though, because to be fair, I think that what Berger did was just take on the vested interests in a way that I think is actually quite courageous. It does have the element of moral courage to it, because he knew that there were going to be objections to this, that you're doing away with certain capabilities that, again, there were people that served in and don't want to see those go away. It's not unlike doing away with amalgamation of regiments in the British Army. In this case, again, I'm just very hesitant to criticize that until also we see whether the advent of the new capabilities he's trying to bring in to enable Marines with almost their own personal drones, again, with machines and with ultimately with machine learning and AI-enabled unmanned systems of various types, again, not just in the air, but on the ground as well, at sea and so forth, how that increases the capabilities, noting again that we do need to focus much more intently on the Indo-Pacific theater than was certainly the case during the 20 years of the post-9/11 era.
Thank you. Can we take another question online? So David Ellery, who is the professor, is a professor at Durham and Oxford universities. David? In which case, can we go to the back right and Peter Mandelson? Yes.
Sounds like David will be ready in a moment.
General Petraeus, it's very good to see you in London. And can I ask you a question about how governments should, politicians should weigh public opinion in going to war? You referred to the Syrian Red Line, and on that occasion, the Labour opposition pledged full support to the government in backing President Obama in taking military action, and then looked at an opinion poll the next day, reversed their position and withdrew their support from the government. A very discreditable incident, one of the most discreditable in the last 10 years, I'd say. But public opinion does have to be weighed. So what advice would you give now to my colleagues in the Labour Party in similar circumstances, should they arise in the future?
Well, again, I think as you're developing big ideas, you have to consider the context. The context includes public opinion. I don't need to tell you, we have a number of former political figures in here, including one who served longer than anyone in history, with one exception in the Western world, as a foreign minister. But you also lead public opinion, and it's, you know, what is the moral clarity of your big ideas? And so it's a judgment of, can you bring this along? What are the limitations, again, of this? At a certain point in time, you do have to acknowledge that. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon inherited a situation in 1969 when they took office with respect to Vietnam that was exceedingly challenging. And they navigated it, to be fair to them, and yes, the ultimate outcome was not what they certainly hoped it would be, but I think navigated it in a very skillful manner, and at some political risk at various points to President Nixon's ultimate re-election, which was very considerable in the end. Once again, this is a feature. By the way, with respect to the military, which is something I'd like to talk briefly about, because I actually formulated over the years big ideas for how military should give advice to their political leaders on the use of force, the commitment of forces, and then also when it comes to drawing down and so forth. And I actually explained this to both of the presidents that I was privileged to serve as the commander of a war, Iraq with President Bush and Afghanistan with President Obama. And when I sat down with them ahead of time, I said, look, I want you to understand what you're getting. When the time comes to talk about the drawdown, you're going to get my best professional military advice. You're going to get a recommendation and a set of options that will be based on my assessment of the mission you've given to us, the tasks that fall out from that, and the facts on the ground, informed by an awareness of the issues with which you have to grapple. Public opinion would be one of them. I mean, ability to get reelected is sort of reasonably foremost in the minds of such individuals. Congressional politics, alliance politics, strain on the force, budget deficits, all of this, the opportunity cost of keeping forces in Afghanistan as opposed to shifting focus to the Indo-Pacific, but driven by facts on the ground. And by the way, that proved very valuable when I was the commander in Afghanistan. We had discussions over the course of about a week, 3 different National Security Council meetings, and I reminded them up front that this is what my recommendation was based on and the options that I provided them. And then, you know, a week later or so, when the president announced his decision, which was to withdraw more up front and to withdraw all the surge forces in a shorter period of time than I advised, I said, with great respect, there's been no change in the facts on the ground, and therefore my recommendation is unchanged. So you're not going to be able to say that this is what Petraeus recommended. By the way, you could feel the oxygen go out of the Situation Room at that moment. But then I said, look, by the way, also I have my confirmation hearing for CIA director tomorrow. The first question I get from the ranking Republican member is undoubtedly going to be, what was your best professional military advice? Because you swear that you will tell them that if they ever ask you when you're confirmed for a 4-star position. And I said, what I'm going to say is that I fully support the decision of the President of the United States. We'll do everything we can with the resources we're provided to continue to accomplish the mission we've been given. But at the end of the day, it was a more aggressive formulation of the drawdown than I recommended. Next question. And that's what I did. It was not a big issue, although it seemed like a bigger issue when I said that in the Situation Room.
There are two parts of the book that go to the heart of what Peter Mandelson was asking. One of them is the situation in France, where the French deliberately adopted torture, and General Massou, the commander-in-chief there, but also the governor of Algeria, holding those 2 posts at the same time, actually condoned the use of torture. And that, of course, turned the French public against it. It was against the Declaration of Human Rights that the French came up with in 1789, went to the heart of what the French Republic was all about, and people turned against the war in Algeria largely as a result of that. And secondly, of course, you have to tell the people the truth. And so some of those DoD briefings that during the Johnson administration that essentially concentrated solely on the number of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese who were being killed, it sort of misled a lot of people for a long time. There's a very good book on this by H.R. McMaster that looks into this. So you've got to level with the public, with your domestic support the entire way through, and you've got to give them the bad news as well as the good. There's a marvellous quote from Churchill about this, where he said that he's always told that he has to keep his ear to the ground as a politician, but he didn't want the British people to see him in so ungainly a posture.
Yes, can we go to the front row? And this will be the final question, I'm afraid, to the lady at the front row.
Thank you very much. I hope it's a good question. Amanda Mosley-Friedman from IP3. And my question is on Ukraine. Ukraine is very controversial for reasons we all know. It's not a member of NATO. What do you feel about the view that's been ascertained that the defense of Ukraine is equal to the defense of NATO and the values upon which NATO was founded?
So let me start actually by recalling what Henry Kissinger has said on this, and it's particularly significant, not just because he wrote a great blurb for conflict, but also because he was one who cautioned against expansion of NATO, as you'll recall, at various junctures. But more recently, he has said that given the provision of support that we have provided to Ukraine, that NATO security now really starts, NATO defenses start at the Ukrainian-Russian border. And I think that's very, very true. Yes, they're not a member of NATO, they're not an Article 5 collective self-defense commitment country, they inevitably should be very awkward to figure out how to do that. I might ask his lordship, if he has any ideas after this, but it's a very thorny issue to, obviously you can't bring a country into NATO when it's at war with another country, which would immediately engulf you in that war. And yet if you announce that that's a limiting factor, it gives an incentive to Putin to continue the war, to keep it out of NATO. So it's a very difficult and thorny issue, but I think it is really inescapable that Western security, not just even NATO security, really starts at that border, certainly on the front lines between Ukraine and Russia.
And of course, in a sense, the Ukrainian war has already enlarged NATO in that it's brought Sweden and Finland into NATO, which is very good news. And there's also, to another degree, I think that the way in which the Russians have reacted and are likely to react in the future mean that they worry, and they're right to worry, that if Ukraine does come into NATO, which I hope it will, you're going to have 900,000 extremely impressive, trained, battle-hardened troops. It's going to be one of the largest, if not the largest, of all the armies in NATO. And it's going to be on the Russian border, and of course it's going to be full of people who are rightly furious about the appalling atrocities that the Russians have committed against their people.
The irony is that Putin set out to make Russia great again, and what he's really done is make NATO great again. Really, again, the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War is Vladimir Putin.
And it feels appropriate on that note to ask Lord Robertson to wind up.
Well, I've been asked to give a vote of thanks, and I think everyone will agree that we've heard a remarkable, albeit brief, expose of so many of the issues involved today. Although I have to take exception with your opening comment. I'm pretty sure everybody recognised exactly what I said. I often had to explain the difference between the New York Mafia and the Glasgow Mafia, because the New York Mafia make you an offer you can't refuse, whereas the Glasgow Mafia make you an offer you can't understand. But I'm asked twice a year by the Defence Academy here to go and talk to the foreign 2- and 3-star officers who they bring across to learn about the British Armed Forces. And they want me to talk about the relationship between the politicians and the armed forces. And I sort of start off by saying, you guys, they are all guys actually, come into the armed forces at the very beginning, and you've reached sort of 2- 3-star levels, knowing so much, huge experience, background, knowledge, exercises and the rest of it. And you are confronted usually with a young Minister of Defence. The average tenure of Ministers of Defence these days is 2.5 years. I just about made that myself. And I see there's another one in the audience over there about the same period of time. And they're going to say no to you. They're going to question your judgment with all the experience you've got. But that is the crucial question that you've entered here today. The politician, however lacking in experience, has got to make the big trade-offs, to bear in mind public opinion, to bear in mind the views of the allies, the wider and broader context in which it has. But I think the crucial thing, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm sure that the lesson will come through, is the crucial question of challenge. That there has to be in the process of decision making, especially when you are putting people in harm's way, of challenge in the system. So where there is no challenge, like Vladimir Putin, without even a Politburo, you can take the decisions much quicker, much easier, but get it completely wrong, as indeed is the case there as well. So that relationship between the politicians and the military, erudite experience as they are, boils down to the politicians making the big judgment on the big ideas. And that's why in the present conflict, we'll win. Zelensky will win. The Ukrainians will win, not through military means, though that is a clear component. It will be because of the unity of the Western world against Vladimir Putin at this time, forcing him to recognize, as Gorbachev did in 1979, that Afghanistan could not be won and was costing the country a huge amount. So it's really by the psychological willpower of the West standing united and committed with that, as you said, maintaining the strategic patience that is required, that will persuade this one man in the Kremlin who made the decision to invade, that one man to change his mind and to come out as well. So the discussion today, and a remarkably qualified panel here today, has given us much food for thought. But it's not academic. It's not any more academic. The people of Ukraine are fighting for their own survival and for our future as well. And therefore, on behalf of the audience, David, Andrew, and Tony, we thank you very much for this a very interesting, fascinating, and educational experience today. Thank you. And before you go, can I just say, this room is being used for another event very briefly after this, so if you could please leave, be advised.